Yesterday, I reported that Tommy Robinson had been transferred from a low-security prison with a low Muslim population to a high-security prison with a high Muslim population filled with murderers. Well, today we found out that Kaylen Robertson, Tommy Robinson's number 2, his closest associate, spoke with Tommy. And Tommy reported that an imam at the new prison told the other inmates that Robinson would be arriving the day before the transfer. But the governor and the guards at both prisons told Tommy Robinson that the transfer was ordered last minute and that the order came from the top. Now, this is a little bit of a he said, she said situation, the word of Tommy Robinson versus the silence of the British government. But based on the facts that we know that Tommy Robinson attempted to expose a pedophilia scandal and the British government attempted to cover the scandal up, personally, I'll take Tommy Robinson's word for it. So, we know that a hit has been put out, a contract for the murder of Tommy Robinson has been put out by an imam. And Robinson reports that last night at the prison, the prisoners were banging on the walls, chanting all night that Robinson was going to be killed. They were taunting him. Now we have to keep in mind that Robinson is in the custody. The prison is the custody of the British government. And anything that happens to Tommy Robinson, the British government is responsible for. This is the same government which recently expelled Russian diplomats following a nerve agent attack that killed a Russian citizen. Now, based on the British government's track record, I don't know if we could take their word for it, especially with the motives on both sides. But for the purposes of this talk, let's take the British government's word for it. So they expelled these Russian diplomats because Russia killed its own citizen, and that's a violation of human rights. And the British government basically stated that a government that violates basic human rights, especially by murdering its own citizens, has no legitimacy. Well, look at the British government's track record versus what it did in expelling the Russian diplomats, because I don't think the British government respects basic human rights when it ignores a pedophile scandal and allows tens of thousands, some estimate 1 million young British children to be raped, victims of pedophilia over decades. I don't think it's the respect for basic human rights when the British government investigates its own citizens for hate speech. I mean, we all have agreed for a long time in the West that free speech is not only a basic human right, but the pillar of what allows Western civilization to be free. That with free speech, the best ideas win. I don't think the British government respects human rights when it silences freedom of the press, when it arrests Tommy Robinson for attempting to expose a pedophilia scandal that the British government covered up, when it puts out a D notice and basically tells everyone in the UK that if they mention Tommy Robinson's name, whether they're in the media, whether they're a citizen, that they themselves will be arrested. I don't think the British government respects human rights when it denies Tommy Robinson a fair trial, when within 4 hours of his arrest, he is sentenced to 13 months in prison. And I certainly don't think the combination of all of that respects human rights, being that they attempted to silence freedom of the press, silence freedom of the speech by arresting Tommy Robinson, sentencing him to 13 months in prison within 4 hours, and making it illegal for anyone to report on it. I mean, it sounds like the government of Britain attempted to make a political opponent disappear. That is an egregious violation of basic human rights. But in fairness, at least it's not the murdering of a British citizen. Now, keep in mind that if a government has to resort to the censoring of its population, it no longer represents the will of its people, because in order for a government to represent the will of its people, it has to at the very least be willing to hear out the will of its people. So, just in the silencing of free speech, freedom of the press, and all of that, the denial of a fair trial, in a way the British government has already declared itself to not have legitimacy. But again, at least it's not murder. Except in the last few days, the actions taken by the British government, to take a non-violent offender who's clearly a political prisoner and transfer them from a low security prison with a low Muslim population to a high security prison filled with murderers and a high Muslim population. A Muslim population which, very clear for political reasons, Sharia law, the rhetoric of Tommy Robinson, have every incentive to want Tommy Robinson dead. To transfer Tommy Robinson, the non-violent offender, and put him in that situation, I think it can be argued that the government is attempting to use radical adherents to the religion of Islam who are locked up in prison with Tommy Robinson to execute Tommy Robinson. And if the government of Britain is setting up a British citizen who is already a political prisoner to be executed, well, let's look at it by their own logic. Because according to the government of Britain, the Russian government, Vladimir Putin's government, has no legitimacy because it murdered its own citizen. Well, I think with the events I just outlined, if the political prisoner Tommy Robinson, who has clearly not only been taken as a political prisoner, but transferred into a situation where his life is in imminent danger, if Tommy Robinson is in fact murdered while in prison, while in the care of the British government as their political prisoner, then based on the British government's own logic, they are admitting that the government of Britain no longer has any fucking legitimacy.